Hello and welcome to AFAL Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on afalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Aval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Alexander Clarkson, lecturer for German and European Studies at King's College London. Thanks for joining us, Alex.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. We are speaking on Wednesday, December 4th, the last day of a two-day gathering of NATO leaders where you are in London. Yesterday, French President Emmanuel Macron pointed out what he saw as Turkey's two major offenses against the alliance. The first is viewing the Syrian Kurdish militia known as the YPG or SDF as a terrorist group, despite the fact that it played a key role in defeating ISIS, and also demanding that its NATO allies do the same, also declare it a terrorist group. The second offense is buying Russian S-400 missile defenses, which could jeopardize NATO security, many observers believe. The first offense to me seems less troubling because the YPG is undeniably linked to the PKK, which the United States and the EU have declared a terrorist group. As for the second offense, NATO was founded to defend against the Soviet threat and still today views Russia as potentially the most destabilizing force in its region. So in buying the S-400s, Turkey has likely strayed further from NATO's foundations than any member in the group's 70-year history. Would you agree with that assertion? And have we learned anything at this summit this week about how NATO leaders might respond?
I think it's very difficult to game out. I mean, the fate of Turkey's relationship with NATO is highly dependent on the position of Erdogan and the long-term development of the Turkish state. I mean, if Erdogan lasts for any particular amount of time, Turkey may be nominally, it may end up a bit like the EU accession process, in which Turkey has a nominal relationship with the EU and has a nominal form of membership, but is more and more cut out of core functions of NATO and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's wider institutional structures because of sheer levels of distrust. I think the YPG issue can still probably be massaged through various mealy-mouthed European commitments without actually attacking the issue head-on. There are also ways of structuring Baltic defense without having to necessarily announce a structured Baltic strategy at the moment. In many ways, it's not a formality. It releases a lot of planning capacities, and it's quite important in many ways to have it formally brought through. But what Turkey is blocking won't necessarily fundamentally block a set of defense relationships and a set of means of defense engagement between the rest of the NATO and the East European states. I think there are other risk factors beyond the YPG that are actually, I think, bigger risks to Turkey's relationship with NATO and the European Union, although these are, of course, distinct relationships that need to be looked at separately. But I think the way in which the YPG situation has escalated, which isn't unprecedented, though. I mean, there were previous phases in the relationship between Turkey and its NATO partners over issues such as Cyprus in the 1970s, or over issues such as the various at least more understanding attitudes to Kurdish demands for autonomy and independence in the 1990s that have caused similar frictions in NATO. The extent to which Erdogan is pushing this far beyond what I think he really needs within the confines of Turkish domestic politics is an indication that if he or a successor appointed by him lasts for any long period of time, there may be a permanent breakdown of trust that reopens, I think, other issues to do with the Eastern Mediterranean and a breakdown of channels of dialogue over other issues related to the Eastern Mediterranean that could lead not just to kind of constant frictions and tensions over the Kurdish issue, but to, when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean, any escalation there could lead to a fundamental breakdown of relations between Turkey and its European partners.
Yeah, you mentioned that Turkey has come under harsh criticism for blocking NATO's new defense plan for Poland and the Baltics in the hopes that its fellow NATO allies will declare the YPG a terrorist group. As Sinan Ugan pointed out in Foreign Policy this week, there's a bigger story behind this. NATO, years ago, 6-8 years ago, NATO devised new defense plans for Turkey and for Poland and the Baltic states and adopted them in early 2016 after receiving unanimous member approval. But soon after that, the United States blocked the implementation of the Turkey defense plan because it included labeling the YPG, which the U.S. had just partnered with in the fight against ISIS, labeling it a terrorist group. Now, in turn, 3 years later, Turkey has blocked the Poland and Baltics plan to demand that the U.S. and NATO accept the YPG as a terrorist group. It seems like, to some extent, it all comes down to solving this global issue of one man's terrorist group is another man's freedom fighter.
I think that there's actually a significant difference now. I mean, the scenario in 2016 was one where, yes, the U.S. Blocked the wording of the Turkish defense strategy and defense structure. So now Erdogan thinks he's acting reciprocally. But in 2016, in the aftermath of the migration crisis and the extent to which the EU was bound into through new treaty relationships and attempt to create new border regime structures with Turkey over the migration crisis, there was still a lot of EU, I wouldn't necessarily call it goodwill, but a lot of EU attempts to assuage a Turkish political leadership that it believed it needed. And in the EU, I mean the EU member states that are also
And that was
whose
all
stances.
before, just to be clear, that was all before Turkey and the EU reached their billion-dollar agreement to deal with the refugee crisis.
Yeah, but I mean, I think even this. I mean, a lot of this in terms of. I mean, look, the role Turkey plays in the EU, and I think this is the problem in a lot of these analyses, is they often cut out the EU dimension of what's taking place. Is the EU's relationship with Turkey in terms of managing border structures and managing the border regime go back over 30 years to 40 years. So there's actually a high level of interdependence between both sides in terms of border regime. There's high level of interdependence between both sides in terms of the customs union and customs structures. What that's meant is that in many cases, there's been a kind of an interesting tension where there is a tension between the role of EU member states as EU member states and their various needs to keep Turkey on board or Turkey happy for various sort of local European border regime structures, and the various tensions that open up over issues such as YPG, Kurdistan, the Kurdish territories of Turkey, and Turkey's NATO membership. So for a substantial period of time, I mean, Turkey often had sort of on the surface level significant tensions with various EU member states that were also NATO member states over the Kurdish issue. But in the end, the Europeans were often willing to find a fudge or willing to compromise or willing to bend because they weren't willing to cause trouble with a Turkey that was both a partner for the EU and also a NATO ally. I think what's changed over the last 4 or 5 years is a shift away from a kind of relationship, despite the attempt to actually solidify this with the 2015 and 2016 refugee agreements. As a shift where the Europeans have become far less willing to acknowledge or deal with Turkish concerns, both for domestic reasons as well as a growing frustration in their relationships with the EU. And that's bled into the stance of EU member states who are also NATO member states into their willingness to sort of tolerate various Turkish demands, which have now culminated in this growing frustration over Turkey's relationship with the YPG and the relationship with the Syrian war. So that tension is opened up at the same time as now the US has become basically more erratic and more unpredictable, so that there's no American side on the table willing to assuage or mediate between a European side that's increasingly frustrated and a Turkish side that is increasingly, willing to assert its concerns and willing to increasingly construct its political identity against both its European and the US partners. You used to have a situation where either the Americans or the Europeans would come across the table and so say that try to negotiate deals with Ankara or fudges with Ankara. Now neither side is willing to do so.
And why has Europe become less willing to address Turkish concerns?
I think this is actually a lot of this is I mean a lot of this in the longer to medium term you can see as yes, Europeans having partial responsibility for this process. Particularly, there was a moment that led to long-term fracture of trust between Turkey and the Europeans with Cyprus' accession in 2004, which is again, it's worth looking at the connections between the tensions between Turkey's relationship with the US and the Europeans in one area, say the Kurds or the YPG, and looking at how it interconnects with fractures of trust in other areas. For example, the way in which the accession process for Cyprus caused a lot of difficulties between both sides and within both sides. And more in the short term, though, I think what under Erdogan we've seen a radicalization of the AKP government and the AKP regime in terms of a sort of radical assertion of a not so much an Islamist, but a Turkish nationalist kind of narrative that culminated in the behavior of the Turkish government both towards Kurdish minorities in Europe and various Turkish dissenting groups in Europe that don't like the AKP within the diasporas in Europe, as well as the behavior of the AKP government during the 2017 constitutional referendum, where the diaspora was mobilized largely for domestic political purposes to show that the AKP was standing up for Turks abroad. And I think this kind of grandstanding by the AKP within the European political space, coupled with an increasing suspicion on the European side, not just on a kind of state level or high official level, but among the wider population, that Erdogan may have somehow been culpable in accelerating the migration crisis in 2015, has meant that the level of tolerance on the European side for Turkish concerns over the YPG or PKK has sort of plummeted, and has actually opened up a lot of space, particularly for both a Cypriot lobby and a Greek lobby within EU membership and within the European Council, as well as on a parallel track, it's opened up space for a very strong, very well organized, very well self-funded, actually primarily self-funded Kurdish diaspora lobby, which is no longer this kind of peripheral working class or marginalized social group, but you have substantial numbers of members of the Kurdish diaspora who are in the middle classes, upper middle classes, or active in the politics of the EU member states and can act as a lobby for Kurdish concerns, which will of course use an opening if the AKP generates self-inflicted wounds and alienates European partners. Of course, the Greek and Cypriot side will take advantage of this, and of course, the Kurdish diaspora lobby groups will take advantage of this to entrench a sense among many EU member states, not just on a popular level, not just in particular political parties, but also even on the state official level, that Turkey is no longer on their side, and that Turkish concerns no longer need to be paid attention to. So what in this term NATO meeting in the last couple of months, Turkey has been hit by, or at least the AKP government has been hit by a double whammy, right? A breakdown in relations with the Europeans, which could culminate not so much over the YPG, but quite potentially in the Eastern Mediterranean, and a breakdown in relations with the US over relations with Russia and the S-400s. And that means that, this sort of what's happening in this debate or disagreement over the YPG and the way in which Turkey's behaving again in this kind of NATO situation, that's only a symptom of a much wider, more fundamental problem that could end up in putting Turkey in a situation where it ends up with losing its relationships or with a breakdown of relationships with its allies without actually having any alternatives to go to. Because I don't personally believe that Russia or China are viable long-term alternatives as allies in the way NATO was for Turkey, if you're thinking about this 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line.
Okay, wow, you raised a lot of. First, I wanted to go back to something you said before. It sounded like you were saying Turkey blocking the Poland and Baltics defense plan doesn't actually make that much of an impact in terms of NATO security. Is that right? Would you say that? And is that also true then for the Turkey defense plan?
I think it makes things more difficult. I think in the end, you have these defense plans are formal. What they do is they enabled much faster command and control, much faster reaction speeds, and they also mean that they embed protocols in the responses of political leaderships that are kind of structured and predictable. So when a certain contingency happens, every side has a clear plan, a clear document setting out what they're going to do in case of that contingency, and that's embedded both in policy making and in terms of automatic responses. So the problem with blocking these plans is that they slow down NATO responses, but they don't make these NATO responses impossible. There are a lot of different workarounds. This isn't the first time that there's been kind of arguments or obstruction or debates about these on the planning level in NATO that are used for other agendas. There for a long period of time, NATO wasn't even a member of NATO's military structure. France wasn't even part of NATO's military structure, and France had even ejected the Americans from French NATO bases in 1964. So, there's always there has been previously a lot of ad hocery and response plans. But a situation where Turkey blocks these plans isn't ideal, and it annoys a lot of people, and it actually offends a lot of Eastern European states as well as Ukrainian partners. And I think Ukraine plays a crucial role outside of NATO within the wider sort of European defense architecture and security architecture. But it offends both the Ukrainians, which the Turks have a burgeoning partnership, also gives the Turks a bit of an alternative to balance the relationship with Russia in the Black Sea. But it in effect alienates a lot of Eastern Europeans in NATO and the Ukrainians unnecessarily, and it actually causes Turkey much more damage than any benefit it would get.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Second question about something you said. You mentioned the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey and Libya made this agreement last week to nail down what they see as their maritime borders, which infringed apparently on some of what Greece and Cyprus see as their territorial waters. How do you see this deal impacting the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Again, this is I think a lot of, again, I sort of mixed feelings about Turkey's stance towards the Eastern Mediterranean issue. On the one hand, there is a case for saying that the EU mishandled Turkey in 2004-05 with Cyprus accession. I think there's a strong case for saying that, and in saying that a lot of the responsibility for the current sort of escalation in relations in the Eastern Mediterranean is anchored in a way in which the EU sort of opened up a space for a pathway to Cypriot accession that was unconditional and not conditioned on the Greek Cypriots sort of engaging more with TRNC or Turkish Cypriot concerns. In the more short-term period, though, I mean, Turkey is effectively stuck. I mean, let's take it from the EU angle. An EU angle interconnects with the NATO angle. When Cyprus is a member state of the European Union, and even though, as long as there's the potential for a channel for dialogue with Ankara, and as long as there's, particularly with the TRNC, with the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus, as long as there's a space, particularly through the interests of many figures in the TRNC, for cutting a deal over Eastern Mediterranean, maybe finding a kind of compromise way of muddling through, the EU is not going to be punitive towards Turkey. It's going to search for channels of dialogue. However, if the EU thinks and if Ankara shores up the impression that Ankara is no longer interested in dialogue, then the EU will always prioritize the interests of a member state over an interest of an ally or partner that's not within the EU. And the Cypriots know that. I mean, the Cypriots can just basically sit and wait and let for the situation to deteriorate. I mean, the best way of putting the Cypriots on the defensive and the Greeks on the defensive is if Turkey opened up dialogue and said, look, there's possible compromise options. We won't push this too hard. We'll debate this. We'll block. The drill ships kind of make sense because they kind of indicate Turkey's claims and they slow down any momentum towards gas drilling from the Greek side.
The more belligerent Turkey is, the better it is for Greece and Cyprus, to some extent.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is something the British never understood with Ireland, right? And even though Ukraine isn't a member of the EU, because Ukraine is wired into the EU system, the EU now has certain commitments towards. I mean, not necessarily what the EU wants wants quiet in the Ukrainian case, but certainly the Ukrainians have a degree of leverage they didn't have if they weren't, even as a non-member state, if they weren't wired into the EU system through the DCFTA. So, I mean, this is then times 100 for a member state. Cyprus is a member state, so the more belligerent the Turks are, the more the Greeks and Cypriots can turn around and say, look, you know, you can't trust Ankara. You're trying dialogue. You tried to be soft about this customs. So every move Turkey makes on this level is sabotages Ankara's long-term terms. That doesn't mean that Turkey doesn't exert pressure. I mean, as I say, the drill ships make sense as a way of exerting pressure without leading to automatically in a pathway towards a cycle of escalation. But the belligerence of Ankara's language around that and the aggression that's been unleashed in Turkish and AKP public media, which also generates a sympathetic response for the AKP case among GHP because there's a wider Turkish social consensus, has done two things. I mean, it's played into Greece and Cyprus's hands. It's also actually, I find interesting if you look at the responses of President Akinci and the TRNC, it's also unsettled the Turkish Cypriots. Right? A lot of Turkish Cypriots aren't necessarily fans of escalation. A lot of Turkish Cypriots don't necessarily want annexation. A lot of Turkish Cypriots actually want some kind of long-term federalized pathway towards reunification in Cyprus. And the paradox is that this is very popular in Turkey, but it's actually unsettling the very people the Turkish government wants to supposedly protect, which is the Turkish Cypriots themselves, who are getting increasingly sketchy about a lot of what's happening in Turkey and Turkish society, in the Turkish state and Turkish society. And the same goes for this Libya deal. I mean, in the short term, yeah, it looks great, and it helps the GNA shore up its own position internally by generating more Turkish military support. But the GNA, which is a faction within Libya, which is a rival of the LNA or HOR faction, right, that doesn't recognize this agreement. So it's not like Turkey has some sort of cast iron agreement with the Libyan state, right? It's because this Libyan state is divided in two. I mean, there's no telling what happens to this deal between the GNA, the Tripoli government, and Turkey if there is a peace agreement. If Haftar climbs off his tree, climbs off the tree in which he's put himself in terms of the siege of Tripoli. I mean, if Haftar and the anti-GNA factions, the anti-Turkish factions step down, and then negotiate a deal. I mean, this deal with Turkey is then suddenly, extremely vulnerable to any final coalition agreement of any peace settlements in the Libyan case. Also, the GNA, this faction with which Turkey has signed an agreement over the waters, also is heavily dependent on indirect and possibly direct support from the Italians. And the Italians and the Italian interest in Libya is largely generated by the role of its oil and gas company, Eni, which, by the way, also has agreed drilling box and exploration rights with the Cypriot government for exactly the waters the Turks want to gain into control. So, I mean, it's not like the GNA's position is straightforward. The Italians have much more leverage in the Libyan context than the Turks do. If the Italians fundamentally decide to put pressure on the LNA and use their channels of dialogue with the LNA with the GNA and their influence on the GNA if the final agreement in Libya to say, well, actually, we need to revise this agreement with the Turks. Any kind of future Libyan government will have to do that because it's the Italians that have the power in Libya, much more so than the Turks do.
One more
And the
follow-up.
Italians have, and the Italians can bank on the fact that the Italians have an enormous influence over EU energy and border policy.
One more follow-up to something you said. You mentioned the Kurdish diaspora and how it's growing in terms of its voice in Europe. I read about this happening in the U.S. in Washington D.C., but hadn't heard much about it in Europe. Is this happening across Europe? Is this in Brussels?
Oh yeah, it's substantial. I mean, you have Kurdish diaspora organizations. They don't necessarily have office in Brussels, but you have several key Kurdish diaspora organizations with either an arm's length relationship with the PKK or the KCK, better to term it as the KCK in this context, or with a direct relationship with the KCK/PKK/YPG. And these are slick lobbying operations. I mean, there's a substantial diaspora fundraising mechanisms. I mean, this vision of the diaspora as being a bunch of people who do purely working class industrial jobs, as you might have been able to say in the 1970s and early 1980s, that's really outdated. I mean, again, it's not necessarily at the same rate as say ethnic German or other communities in Germany, but there now is a substantial Kurdish middle class. There are Kurdish doctors, lawyers, professionals, academics, politicians, even Kurdish politicians on the Landtag or even Bundestag level in Germany, say, or in the Netherlands, and they have a voice, and they're very effective lobbyists, and they have a set of shared strategic goals around protecting. I mean, the PKK renewed military campaign in Turkey is much more controversial. That's much more divisive within the Kurdish community. But there's a high degree of unity around protecting whatever achievements have been held together in what some would call Rojava in Syrian the Kurdish parts of Syria. And so this is an effective, and this is a logging operation that builds on decades of close relationships with substantial parts of the German, Dutch, French, Belgian, Italian, also particularly Italian center left, and even left liberal circles, what Americans would call centrist circles. So these people have reach, and I mean that you have a Turkish government behaving as if it always has the kind of advantage in these kinds of situations. It's the Kurdish diaspora lobby that has the reach and the sympathy and the kind of can build on sympathetic relationships with substantially powerful people in the EU structure that also then affects their behavior when they interact with NATO. And the AKP believes it can use the Turkish diaspora against this, which is often misguided because the Turkish diaspora is deeply internally divided. So the Kurdish diaspora is relatively united. It can act as a united actor with a strong middle class, upper middle class leadership, whereas the Turkish diaspora is at war with itself, with rival factions who dislike or like the AKP, fundamentally disagreeing about how to handle a whole set of social issues. So in that sense, the AKP cannot generate the level of cohesive diaspora action that the PKK/KCK/YPG can.
This rising Kurdish diaspora in Europe seems to highlight one of the more significant challenges facing NATO, how it can retain political cohesion when each member state has a different perception of asymmetric threats. I mean, Turkey, for instance, not only sees the U.S. partner YPG as a terrorist outfit, but views most advocates of the Kurdish movement in Europe as terrorists, or at least delivering terrorist propaganda, and also views Turkish Imam Fethullah Gulen, who has been living safely in the U.S. for 20 years, as the mastermind of a failed 2016 coup and head of a global terrorist organization with a significant presence across Europe. Is there any way NATO can address these concerns?
I think as long as you have a particular political dynamic within Turkey that forces Erdogan to constantly overplay his hand with his key allies and partners. And as long as you have a domestic political dynamic in Turkey where it generates an environment where Erdogan and the inner circle around Erdogan believe that this kind of game of playing a new Turkey, Turkey as a global power, Turkey as a genuine partner of Russia and China, then I'm not very optimistic about Turkey's relationship with its particularly with its European allies, but also with its U.S. allies. And I think this doesn't mean that Turkey in and of itself is in an intractable position. I mean, previous governments, the Özal government, the 1990s, for all he's maligned, not so much Davutoglu, but the team around Davutoglu, also managed to develop effective channels and approaches towards sort of isolating the PKK, KCK in European debate. So in both cases, you had Turkish governments who domestically had a more flexible approach towards issues of Kurdish autonomy and identity. You had Turkish governments who had a more realistic appreciation about the extent and reach of Turkish power as a geopolitical actor. And in that context, they were all still able to, for example, externally build relations with Russia and China, but had a realistic appreciation about how China and Russia would treat Turkey if when the chips are down. I mean, I don't think that, I think the idea that Russia would take any risks to save Turkey over any issue is a deeply misguided point of view. And I think that will be a big shock to the Turks when the chips are down over something that Turks think matters and the Russians think is disposable. Similarly, as long as Turkey was at least making a show of reconciliation with various elements of the Kurdish community, then it was much easier for Ankara to turn around and say, look, these PKK, KCK guys are extremists. This is a diaspora that has the kind of the diaspora organizations you're dealing with in Europe. They have a kind of illusions about the developments on the ground. They're promoting a particularly nationalist strand of thought. There are other Kurds in Turkey that have a different view, or other Kurds in Syria, and other Kurds in Iraq. So I mean, I think this is very much, dependent on how Turkish domestic politics play out. Whether this dynamic where Erdogan is constantly beating a certain drum and constantly escalating domestically to stay on top, that is obviously going to have knock-on effects on European and U.S. allies. My point, I don't think, though, that the Kurdish issue would be the threshold of no return. I think any move by Ankara, say, to annex Turkish Cyprus or the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, or to do very aggressive moves around Cyprus that would cross a certain red line, both for Greece, Cyprus, and EU properties. I think Cyprus is the point of no return in these relationships.
Not Syria.
Not Syria. Cyprus is the point of no return. Syria is making it worse and worse, and the attack, and it's what's really remarkable for me is to look at this as a form of Turkish self-sabotage. There are ways of Turkey asserting what, in its view, are legitimate concerns, without constantly overplaying its hand and constantly sabotaging its ability to make its case.
Speaking of that, how does the German government view followers of Gulen and advocates of the Kurdish movement, and how has it been handling Turkey's obsession with chasing them down? Turkish officials have repeatedly asserted that some 10,000 terrorists move about freely in Germany. What's the German government's take on this, and does it trouble bilateral relations?
I think the Kurdish issue troubles bilateral relations more than the Gulen issue. I mean, the Gulenists were very, very successful at generating an image of being moderates, and engaged in multi-faith dialogue and so on a local level. So local German politicians and regional politicians, to which the center is sensitive. You've got to remember that Germany is a federal system, where what happens in Berlin is very dependent on, political maneuvering and shifts of politicians in all the 16 different provinces, the 16 different Bundesländer, because in the second chamber of the German parliament, any major legislation that needs to go through has to go through the second chamber of the German parliament, where all the members of the second chamber are appointed by the provinces, the Bundesländer. So, the Gulen movement's influence in lobbying on a local and regional level has some impact. On the federal level, on the national level, though, intelligence services, Kanzleramt, the main party leaderships at the federal level, have a much more of an arm's length relationship with the Gulenists. So that's less damage. That's still damaging because of the local impacts. But on the national level, in Berlin, there's more skepticism towards Gulen. So that's less of a risk. The main risk is actually this kind of approach towards more the Turkish leftists, Turkish journalists, figures like Cem Dündar, who are Turkish journalists and intellectuals that have fled to Germany, and these are people who are finding places in the German academic, political, institutional, structural system, because there's so much movement back and forth between Turkey and Germany. It's not super difficult for Turks who flee Turkey as intellectuals or leftist intellectuals or secular liberal intellectuals to find jobs or find a place to develop their careers in Germany. They're influencing debate among substantial parts of the intellectual bourgeoisie on the center right and center left. And also the fact that the Kurdish community is now so much part of German life. I mean, it's the Kurdish community. The last decade of the Kurdish community in Germany has been very much about its entry more and more into the mainstream of German political, social, and economic life. And I think this has been misread by Ankara, and it's been really profoundly misunderstood by Ankara, that as a diaspora enters the mainstream of German political and economic and social life, and cultural life, that substantial parts of that diaspora are going to be able to exert influence, talk to partners on the German side make their case for Kurdish autonomy or Kurdish independence on the German side in a way they weren't able to 20 or 30 years ago, and be listened to on the German side. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Ankara can't be robust towards the PKK or KCK in making its case. It's just that the more Ankara overplays its hand, the more Ankara sends in things like hit squads or incites Turkish biker gangs or organized criminals to attack Kurdish or Turkish dissident targets, the more it alienates the German side, who it will eventually need. I mean, if there's a serious financial crisis, for example, in Turkey, the Ankara will have to go to Berlin and Brussels for a number of reasons. And if there's a serious escalation in Cyprus, the Cypriots and Greeks can now turn around to the Germans, to Berlin and Brussels, and say, look, we told you so. And there'll be much more receptive people in Berlin and Brussels to an anti-Turkish case or an anti-Ankara case, because in parallel to this, in a different political and social space, Kurdish diaspora activists who are now part of the mainstream will have made their case about Ankara being an unpredictable or dangerous risk to European civilization.
You mentioned exiled Turkish journalist John Dündar. He wrote an article for the Washington Post this week detailing how Turkey might be plotting to assassinate dissidents abroad, and in fact, may have already done so back in Paris in, I think, 2013. He pointed to Germany as the most likely place because of, as we have said, Turkish officials have said some 10,000 terrorists move freely there. What do you think of this possibility? It seems like you think that Turkey has already kind of weaponized biker gangs in Germany and may have sent in hit squads.
I mean, there's no certainty about the hit squads. There's a lot of chatter from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, which is Germany's CIA, as well as Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, which is Germany's MI5, so to speak, and the BKA, Bundeskriminalamt, which is Germany's FBI. From all three security sources, as well as on the regional level, of parallel security services on the regional level, there's a lot of chatter about MIT sending people in and then MIT presence. Nothing's been confirmed yet, but I mean, increasingly there is a sense that Turkey is overplaying its hand and going too far. The primary concern, though, is the possibility that, and I think there's more evidence for that MIT is still going to subcontract violence against various Turkish dissidents or Kurdish dissidents or Gülenists to the Osmani biker gang. So there's various, that was made illegal, but there's various other kind of mafia biker gang networks. So Sedat Peker, for example, there's Turkish mafiosi in Turkey who came from Germany, for example. Some of the most famous mafiosi in Turkey actually also have roots in the German guest worker community. But you have these biker gangs. You also have things like the organizations like the Grey Wolves, so various ultra-nationalist gangs or various sort of AKP-affiliated groups that tend towards violent action. And I think there's a growing sense that amongst German security circles, widespread, that the MIT is going to weaponize and subcontract attacks on dissident partners, which have already flared up in several cases, like against Deniz Naki and others. And so they can claim that this isn't us, but it's actually MIT inciting or funding these kinds of actions. The thing is, wouldn't be the first time. I mean, if you look at the police and intelligence service files from the 1980s, MIT was very, very active in an extremely violent way towards Kurdish organizations or PKK organized groups and operatives in 1980s Germany. In 1990s Germany, there were multiple incidents where MIT had its fingers in various ways, means of intimidation of PKK and other related groups, as well as Turkish leftist groups like the GHKPC or Devrimci Sol or Bolshevik Partizan. There's a long tradition of this.
MIT was sending operatives, or was hiring local groups, or
hiring local groups, sending operatives, using disinformation, a real pain in the backside for the Turkish and Kurdish communities are so big in Germany that almost every major German city has a Turkish consulate, right? So there's a huge Turkish diplomatic presence spread across Germany. So that's not necessarily MIT acting directly, but it's, for example, you would have cases in 1980s, 1990s, and again now, where MIT consuls or Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs consuls or diplomatic staff would socialize with various extremely dubious ultra-nationalist or vaguely organized crime-ish characters in the Turkish community, that you have all these kinds of interrelationships. There's also the European Union of Turkish Democrats. A lot of this is sort of in the ether, but a lot of this is rumored. That also has all kinds of interesting relations with people that I wouldn't necessarily invite for lunch or have a drink with, in terms of their ideological behavior and propensity towards violence. And so what you have then is this has been a long problem, and relations between the German intelligence services and the Turkish intelligence services have never been good. The last time they were really good was during the 1980 Turkish coup. I mean, where 1980 coup in Turkey, which was not backed by Germany and the United States, but at least seen positively by Germany and the United States, at least in terms of intelligence security circles. Right after then, as these things escalate in the diaspora, the relationships have always been pretty fraught by both sides, because the Turks, to a certain extent, and in some cases understandably, think that the Germans are soft on whether West German partners are soft on Kurdish organizations or Kurdish radical organizations. But from the West German perspective, I mean, it's not like these organizations are part of much wider communities that can have the potential to generate enormous disruption. And the last time the West German state tried to systematically crack down on PKK organizations in 93, 94, when they banned them and then tried to arrest and shut down all these organizations through police actions, you had at least you had a year of absolute turmoil, because you would have, at a time in which other factors were also generating turmoil in the German system. So in 93, 94, you had thousands of PKK activists blocking German motorways, or you had PKK activists walking in the middle of German streets and squares and self-immolating themselves. You had violence, riots, shootings. I mean, in the end, there were various sort of compromise ways in which the German government, West German government intelligence services found a way of sort of coming to arrangements or developing a dialogue that also pressured the PKK or then KCK groups to spiral down their own violence in German society. But, you know, you have two sides, the German side and a Turkish intelligence side with fundamentally different priorities in terms of fundamentally different views as to how to manage this kind of a shared problem. And that means that relations aren't good at all. And the MIT can simply go back and deal with networks it's dealt with before. So, I mean, I think it's not some conspiracy theory. It's embedded in 30 years of historical experience, the relationships between Turkish security services and their West German partners and their German partners in German society.
Let's say Ankara is found to have backed an assassination attempt or executed an assassination either via a hit squad or some local group. How might the German government respond? What are its options? I think it's interesting that the German government seems to have done very little in response to an apparent Russian assassination of a Georgian rebel in Berlin earlier this year.
I think the issue with the assassination of the Kisto Georgian Chechen activist, I think that has a lot to do with tensions between the German Federal Prosecutor's Office and the German Foreign Office. The German Foreign Office wants to prioritize. I mean, the sanctions regime over Ukraine will stay in place with Russia, but they're trying to develop different channels of dialogue in order to maybe find ways of pragmatic deal making with Russians with the Russians wherever it doesn't undermine the EU position in Ukraine. And I think that's possible. I think the Russians are interested in that as well. But on the other hand, the German Federal Prosecutor's Office wants, you know, they have a certain job and they see they want to do with their job, and they want to pursue this issue. So I think in the end, there's only so much the German Foreign Office can do to block a Federal Prosecutor's Office who wants to see heads roll. And I think we'd have a similar dynamic. I think there are enough. I think the MIT isn't stupid, right? I think the MIT knows it can get away with beating people up in the streets and you know, burning down a car or various forms of really nasty intimidation short of assassination, because that is always still enough that there will be prosecutions and discontent in the German intelligence services and a German federal prosecutor's office. But that will never go to the extent necessarily of a fundamental breakdown of relations. The threshold would be crossed if a prominent known member of the Kurdish community was killed, like directly assassinated in a way that is then traced back to the Turkish intelligence services or various organized crime proxies that they might use. And I think there are wise heads in MIT that knows this and know how far to push it. But there are also people in the AKP inner circle who are not wise and are not particularly attuned to the red lines. And if you have a proper killing, a direct assassination which can be traced, I mean, I think the Auswärtiges Amt and those parts of the German intelligence services interested in cooperation with Turkey would try to slow down the momentum towards pointing fingers and arresting people and setting out European arrest warrants and also maybe liaising with the European Public Prosecutor's Office that's going to come on stream in a couple of months' time. But there's only so much Auswärtiges Amt and the intelligence, external intelligence services can do to slow that down. Once the Federal Prosecutor's Office, the Bundesstaatsanwalt, decides they want to go for it, and once the Bundeskriminalamt and those parts of the BND and BFV decide they want to go for it, they have legal structures on their side to pursue this. And there's strong precedents for this in the mid-1990s when The German Foreign Office tried to slow down a similar prosecution against the Iranian regime over an assassination of Iranian Kurdish activists in 1994, where there's a very murky story of the German foreign policy establishment trying to slow down this prosecution. In the end, the foreign prosecutors, the federal prosecutor's office saying, no, screw it, we're going to go for this. In the end, the Foreign Office had to concede, and there were severe ructions in the German-Iranian relationship at the time. So, I mean, there's a kind of a threshold at which they can do this or get away with this. But if they cross that threshold, I mean, it would be pretty. I mean, it wouldn't be as catastrophic as an Eastern Mediterranean Cyprus escalation, but it would basically break down any security cooperation on a day level that's left.
Mm-hmm. This all goes back to the issue of Turkish influence in Germany, which is largely achieved through mosques run by a Turkey-linked Islamic organization, DITIB. German officials have been saying for more than a year, for years, that they would like to reduce that influence. And last month, they funded a startup project to begin training imams domestically in Germany to alleviate the need from them being trained and assigned by the Turkish government. How do you see that program working, and how do you see Germany's efforts to reduce Turkish influence succeeding?
I think that effort and that kind of evolution of mainstream as sort of middle of the road Islamic structures in Germany would have been inevitable, even if relations between Turkey and Germany were ideal. Because what you're seeing within Islamic congregations or communities or within the Turkish specific parts of the Turkish community itself, even among parts of the Turkish community that are still strong, and there's substantial parts of the Turkish community that are still strongly AKP loyal, but even in those aspects of the Turkish community, you're seeing a generational change. I mean, if you look at a figure like Belit Onay, who's now the mayor of Hanover, I mean, we're talking about first, second, third generation people coming in, people even in the fourth generation. And obviously, once you're talking about third or fourth generation parts of diaspora, their relationship is going to be with Turkey and with the country of origin, with their families in Turkey, is going to be more distanced over time, and they're going to be increasingly embedded in German society. So a gradual sort of embedding of these Islamic structures increasingly in a German context, and a move within these communities. I mean, there's a lot of communities that themselves are a little bit frustrated with Diyanet structures. There's even Diyanet trained, Turkish state trained imams who arrive in Germany and are smart people, and after 2 or 3 years think, we need to do things differently here. And we need to maybe reform and change DITIB and embed it more locally. I mean, I've actually find that DITIB and imams are often underestimated in the German context. There's a lot of smart people who come through this and settle in Germany and themselves, are very conscious of what needs to be done.
You mean like more willing to sort of cut the cord with Ankara than most would expect?
Yeah, but this would be a natural process. It wouldn't have had to be some fundamental rupture. It would have had to be a gradual embedding of these structures in German context and a placing them under the same legal frameworks that, say, the German Protestant, German Catholic, and the churches, the Orthodox churches to a less extent, but primarily Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish communities, Jewish religious structures have in Germany, which is embedded in a kind of state. They also have access to a church tax. So there is a form of taxation in Germany that is directly funds religious life, and which, DITIB and other organizations could gain more direct access to if they structure their way. They get more money that way, and they have an income stream, therefore, that is separate from that they might get through Diyanet or diaspora funding structures. So that's another incentive to stabilize this and expand this. And so it would have been a natural process anyway. I mean, the adversarial nature of this process has to do with two factors that are at play. I mean, of course, there's the fact that you have a fundamental breakdown in trust between the German government and many German political parties and their erstwhile Turkish partners. I mean, one of the ironies of DITIB was that it was initially set up with great enthusiasm by the German government, because they thought that Turkey and Diyanet, Turkish State Religious Directorate in the 1980s, would be a structure that would stabilize the Turkish community and de-radicalize the Turkish community and draw it away from the left. Or away from both hard left-wing views or from other Islamist risks. And so, what was once a basis of trust and partnership has led to a breakdown, because what the AKP has done is again overplayed its hand and overused these structures to promote a particular AKP form of messaging that alienated the German government in a way, the similar kinds of attempts to instrumentalize Diyanet didn't alienate German governments in the 1990s. So, I mean, what in a sense the AKP done is has accelerated in a much worse atmosphere a process that was happening anyway. And it's also a process that's also a product of the internal life of these communities. There are substantial parts. I mean, it's interesting. Even people who were once affiliated with Mili Gauche or those kinds of organizations are frustrated in the German context, frustrated with what is offered by DNet. I mean, many are more theologically adventurous. Many are genuinely want some sort of spiritual engagement that they often find is missing from a kind of particular DNet approach to religious life. There are answers and dynamics in German society and within the diaspora that the DNet doesn't fundamentally kind of understand, I think. And many DNet trained imams understand this. Many smart people who are now heading these mosques perfectly understand this, but themselves feel constrained by their training and by their link with DNet to kind of evolve these communities further in a way that can make them sustainable over the long term and doesn't lose the third or fourth or fifth diaspora generation or lose its interest or lose any engagement with its spiritual life. So there's, I think again, a lot of this is a natural process as you find the diaspora embedding itself and becoming part of the establishment and mainstream of the society, but it's being done and accelerated in a very adversarial and very nasty fashion because of the way in which the AKP has overplayed its hand both in Turkey as well as within the diaspora.
About Turkey NATO or about Turkey Germany that hasn't been said?
I mean, I think ultimately, I think it's on a personal level. I find it very saddening. I think there was a lot of hope about the Germany-Turkey relations, about Turkey-EU relations that have. I mean, I think the EU in an earlier phase of this has EU member states have a lot of responsibility for how things have ended up. But I think in the last 3 or 4 years, this has been actually primarily a story of the AKP taking a position that wasn't impossible and then overplaying its hand. And I think to understand the deterioration on the NATO side, it's important to factor in what's been happening on the EU side as well. And this is a kind of a self-reinforcing dynamic. And I'm deeply, deeply worried that if you look at the rhetoric coming out of AKP media outlets or the AKP about the Eastern Mediterranean and Cyprus, I don't think they really understand that that's the red line, and that would be it. And I really hope that there are still responsible voices in Ankara and the AKP that know that.
Alexander Clarkson, lecturer at King's College London. Thanks so much for joining us.
All right, thanks very much.
Hello and welcome to AFL Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on aflnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.